physicians. The War Department said none of us were qualified to practice medicine, and they would not allow us to be doctors and take care of the wounded. Now, I never listened to anyone, even as a volunteer, as to work as a doctor. I continued to pursue that, and eventually one totally exhausted doctor let me help him out, which was my start anyway at being a physician there. My experience in Washington City was very upsetting, not only because of my difficulties, but there were so many wounded at that point, and the female nursing corps was really not well established that early yet. And so a lot of the wives and the mothers of the wounded were coming into the city to take care of their loved ones. Now, the unaccompanied women, and these women were unaccompanied because their loved ones were wounded, sitting in the hospital. Unaccompanied women were considered prostitutes. As a result of that, they were not admitted to hotels, they weren't admitted to boarding homes, and the women were living on park benches in Washington City. I found that totally unacceptable, and in my very subtle style, I went and pursued and got some businessmen and some politicians, and they actually raised enough money that they opened boarding homes, and so these women had a place to stay. And eventually the women in Washington City organized into the Washington Relief Association, and women, all the major cities eventually organized into larger organizations, and they really raised millions of money to provide additional help and supplies for the men during the war. Now, after I thought, well, if I can work in a hospital in Washington City, they really needed help on the battlefield. And so I decided that I was going to serve there. I went to Warrington, I went to Fredericksburg, eventually to Chickamauga. It's interesting is even though the male doctors were not pleased with me, the men loved me. And they really felt that I was giving them good care. I got a lot of support from them, despite, again, the War Department wouldn't even acknowledge that I would exist. And eventually, one very brave general, General George Thomas, he had an opening. And I really think with my men petitioning and said that I could fill the position is he was willing to give me a contract. Now, obviously, I never got a commission. The War Department would never approve my getting a petition and getting a commission. Now, I certainly felt like I deserved one. I should have been a captain or major, just like any other doctor. I actually wrote a letter to President Lincoln about this and clarified why I should get my commission. And I kept a copy of the letter he sent back to me, which basically said is, no way am I going to deal with you whatsoever. Let the War Department deal with it. Can you imagine that, even with his wife and who she was? And he still rejected that completely. Now, after the Battle of Chickamauga, I went into the countryside. The Southern women and children really did not have any good medical care, and which I was providing for them. And while I was there, I was captured as a spy. I will say, whether I was spying, I will never admit that I ever was spying. I have no notes, no records. You would never know that I was spying. I must say that the letter from General Sherman, when I was awarded the Congressional Medal, talked about my reporting on troop movements, but I've never admitted that I've done any spying. But anyway, I was captured, and I was put into one of the most horrendous Confederate prisons in Richmond. Libby is the most famous. I was in Castle Thunder, which is across the street. These were old tobacco warehouses. There was no ventilation, no windows. It was the most horrendous conditions that I have ever seen in my whole life. Because I was the only female there, I did have my own room versus all the men that were crowded in one room. But I had a straw mat, you understand, no ventilation whatsoever, rats crawling through everything, vermin was in the food. I was allowed to go out on a closed-in porch once a week to get a little bit of air. I volunteered to take care of the sick and the wounded and the men, and this horrible commandant would not allow me to do it. He absolutely wasn't allowed to provide any care. Now, I was exchanged after 4 months for a captain, which was really a miracle since I had no rank, and that was a big thing to be exchanged for a captain. Why me? I really think the commandant was really glad to get rid of me because I was trying to be in his office and yelling at him all the time, and I think he was finally fed up with me. After I was exchanged, I lost about half my weight and I lost half my vision. And that really made it difficult for me to practice medicine very well after that whatsoever. But I still had my contract when I was discharged, and I wanted to finish out my contract and went to Atlanta with General Sherman briefly, and then they had to figure out what to do with me. And so they made me like a medical director of a women's prison in Louisville. Now, when I got to this prison, the first thing it was all female Confederate women, and the male guards there were really freely having their way with all these women. I found that totally unacceptable. I said, this is going to stop. What happened is they fired me and threw me out. I didn't have a chance at all to deal with any of that. And the war pretty much ended after that. And of course, I had to earn a living, and I went to England for a while, and I went there basically to talk about my mode of dress. And I want to comment about that. How I look to you is not typically how the women during the Civil War dressed. I am looking for anyone here. I want to show you how a woman typically dressed in the very big hoop skirts, with the skirt down to the ground, with very tight corsets, their hair tightly down, narrow shoes or boots is what they wore, and I felt that there is absolutely no way that women ever could achieve equality to men dressed like that. You have to have freedom of movement. You have to be able to breathe. Who can breathe in a corset? You can't breathe. The skirts to the ground just put up dirt, and you would get sick from that. So I completely rejected that mode of dress, and instead I designed my own uniform. It's my uniform, and even my good clothes were the same way, which is pants. I feel women have to wear pants. I do wear a skirt, but it's down to the knee. I wear no corsets. My boots are square-toed, so that there's a lot of room. I should comment that women then are so, especially well-off women, concerned about getting into little shoes. They would cut off their small toes so they could fit in. That was the mode of dress. Now, it wasn't acceptable how I am dressed. It wasn't acceptable to men, and it actually wasn't acceptable to women. Now, I would walk down the streets of New York City dressed exactly like I am right now. You can see, fully covered, my uniform. Anytime a policeman would see me, they would arrest me. They said, this is indecent dress. I was put in jail overnight, and I paid a lot of fees to get out of jail because I was continually arrested. And I think that's one of the things I was most notorious about. And women didn't approve either. I mean, they called me a hermaphrodite. I had every imaginable horrible name for how I dressed, whether I always feel this is the appropriate way. I'm female. This is the appropriate way that a female should dress. So, again, I was struggling then after the war. I had to earn a living, couldn't practice medicine. After the war, all the men who participated in the war got pensions. None of the women did. A female nursing corps was started for the first time during the Civil War, and none of the nurses got pensions either. And I certainly didn't get a pension. Thus, that was unacceptable, so I was in Washington petitioning all the time, and I actually succeeded in helping along with other people, but I helped get pensions for the nurses, but I wasn't able to get one for myself. So I said I still had to make a living. And so I thought a good way is maybe I'll get a government job working in the Department of Pensions in Washington. Well, you can imagine what they thought about that. Obviously, they didn't give me the job, and that didn't make me happy. By this time, it was President Grant who was in the White House. Thus, well, and the White House then was open. No fences, no locked doors. It was an open building. So I took my sleeping mats, I took cooking tools, I went into the West Wing, and I set up camp there. And I said to President Grant at that point, I said, I'm not going to leave until you give me a job so I can earn a living in Washington. He let me sit there for 2 weeks. After 2 weeks, he came out and he said to me, all right, I'll give you a job, but you got to dress like a woman. You can't dress like this. Now, obviously, I will never give up my mode of dress, but I left. He did offer me a job. Right after that, Mrs. Grant said, this will never happen again. That's when the fence went around the White House. They locked it up. You know, I'm responsible for a locked White House now. I started that. It was, again, it was just a very difficult time for me in struggle. I spent my life working for women's issues. I attempted to get involved in suffrage activism. I actually, they locked me out of the doors of protection because one, my mother dressed as if it was inappropriate or defective from my cause, and I think that a lot of the pictures in the newspaper were made. They really, this isn't the answer. It's really giving up on competition.
I was probably that slim once.
I wrote 2 books. And my famous book is called Kid. And the book was published, I think, in 1971. And I want to write about women's issues in the first issue of the book the men after the war, a lot of them were elected to
Congressmen supported
they
made one failure.
understand how it was
actually good for us.
and there was a lot of alcohol use and abuse, and they were addicted to alcohol. I believe that both these drugs, especially alcohol, causes softening of the brain. And so I really felt there has to be abstinence and there should be no alcohol whatsoever. But my concern was for the family. And the men, because of the alcohol and the opiate use, were also violent. And I talked a lot about family violence and how this was hurting the family. The second issue that I brought up was that men smoked during that period of time. And I felt that shortened their lifespan and it caused a lot of illness, but I also talked about that their smoking was harmful to their wives and children, and that it also produced illness and problems. And as I have heard from the future, secondhand smoke and actually domestic abuse were 2 ideas that maybe about 100 years after my death were adopted, but my book was actually rejected. All these ideas were rejected. I also brought up the idea that most women worked in the homes and they worked very long hours, and the only way they could be